Hi, I'm Rob Taylor, and in this screencast I'm going to look at using Silver Efex Pro 2 for black and white photography, and the advantages it has over using Photoshop alone. You may have heard of the Nik software suite, a range of photographic plugins from Nik software for various post-processing purposes like sharpening or HDR. Silver Efex Pro is one of them, and is exclusively a black and white conversion and processing plugin. Since Nik got bought by Google, it's no longer possible to buy standalone programs, but conversely the entire suite is now available for just $150. Available on Mac or PC, it'll install into Photoshop, Lightroom, or Aperture. Today I'm looking at the Photoshop version. It gets applied as a filter, taking you into a pop-up user interface where all the adjustments are made. Once you hit OK, the processing is applied and rendered to a duplicate layer. So why Silver Efex over Photoshop? One word: speed. While it's possible to create the same or similar effect through a number of layers, blurring, dodging and burning, masking, layer blending, all the rest of it, Silver Efex generally produces the intended effect more or less by default. Through the use of combinations of presets, sliders and control points, it allows rapid adjustments in a more organic analog fashion. The good thing about Silver Efex is that it doesn't need to be destructive editing as you might expect. It can operate as a smart filter, so either import your image as a smart object, or convert your image layer to one, and Silver Efex will recognize this and function as a smart filter. This allows you to easily go back in and edit settings whenever you need to. Usually all that's required for cleanup after the fact is regular healing and the odd occasional dodge or burn where it's more convenient to do so after the fact than use a control point. The end result tends to look much cleaner than heavy Photoshop processing, thanks to Silver Efex's specialized nature over Photoshop's need for general abilities. Well, unless you heavily lean on the fine structure slider for sharpening, that is. That has a tendency to really bring out the noise. Silver Efex interprets it itself as a fine structure. There are various other elements of the UI which are invaluable for black and white work, but not found within Photoshop. I'll look at those later. Again, a win for specialization. Next, let's break down the options for working within Silver Efex. First, I'll look at the presets, since this is where I generally start. There are a variety available for many different effects, from smooth and silky to gritty and grungy, modern styles to vintage looks. I have a couple of favorites that I almost always end up using, but the beauty of the preset panel is that you can experiment quickly without making any permanent alterations. When you first bring up the Silver Efex plugin and it finishes pre-processing the image, the default view is neutral. This is just the image, desaturated. The Silver Efex conversion isn't the same as regular Photoshop desaturation, however. It appears to actually convert the image using Nik's proprietary algorithms into how it would have appeared on black and white film. Anyone who's tried simple desaturation in Photoshop knows how bad it usually looks, so even just the neutral preset is generally a major step up. Indeed, sometimes when I've really nailed the lighting on a shot, neutral is all I need and no further manipulation is necessary. From there, you can just click through the previews and experiment as fast as your computer can re-render the image. The presets are literally that, custom combinations of slider values saved into on-demand looks, so even once you've applied one, you can continue to tweak it to your heart's content. For example, take one of my favorite presets, 016 Full Dynamic Smooth. When you have the full Global Adjustments panel open, you can see this preset boosts the mids a little, applies a fair amount of contrast, both regular and soft, then applies about 40% tonality protection in order to compress the dynamic range. This results in a smooth but punchy image. However, you don't necessarily have to be stuck with this. Take this image. The high-key nature of this shot confuses Silver Efex a little. Full Dynamic Smooth ends up darkening the background slightly and overly brightening the center of the face. To remedy this, I can drop the midtones from 18% to let's say -13, and that results in a generally punchier look. Some of the sliders are fairly self-explanatory. There are a couple of terms that you may not have come across before: soft contrast and structure. Soft contrast is probably my favorite slider, simply because I love the soft contrast aesthetic. It feels very filmic to me. It increases the contrast of larger areas and ignores the small details, as the transition between tonal areas is softened. Detail is retained, but not significantly strengthened, and it emphasizes the lighting within a scene. Structure is a form of sharpening, but it focuses on larger details more than a few pixels across. More or less like Photoshop's unsharp mask with the radius and threshold turned up a bit, or Lightroom's clarity slider. Next up, control points. These apply the global adjustment sliders to a localized area of the image. Clicking on the control points button makes the cursor into a target, which you then click with on the area of the image you want to adjust. This creates a camera raw light adjustable circle where the adjustments are applied to. This is just an approximation though, as the effects feather for about another diameter of the circle all around it. An important consideration when targeting with the control point system is that you can't be sloppy about where you pin the point. It doesn't simply apply the local settings uniformly throughout its area like a Photoshop brush, but makes targeted adjustments based specifically on the tonality of the pixel under the pin. If you have a cluster of light pixels on an area of shadow, and you're trying to brighten that shadow, accidentally setting the pin on that light cluster will cause the adjustment to apply less to the area that you're actually trying to manipulate. Using the loop in the corner can help with this, but if you're having difficulty hitting an exact target, selecting the Show Hide Selection checkbox gives real-time information on exactly where the control point is targeting as you move it around. It looks like a layer mask. Filters can achieve a similar effect, based on the color of the original image underneath. If you shot black and white film back in the day, or still do, you'll know that colored filters are important for achieving the right appearance of the final image. If you want your sunlit cumulus clouds to really pop out of a deep blue sky, pop an orange filter on the lens. It'll let the yellow-white sunlight pass through normally, but it'll cut out a lot of the blue light from the sky itself, making it appear very dark. Silver effects is the same. The red, orange, yellow, green and blue filters on offer are applied exactly as if they were being put over the lens as you shot the image. Red darkens foliage, orange darkens skies, yellow brightens skin, blue darkens skin. So think as if you're shooting black and white and it'll make sense. These filters can apply local adjustments very efficiently if you're looking to manipulate based on color information. The final two option panels are based on stylizing the output. Depending on your style, you may never use them. They're called film types and finishing adjustments. Film types allows you to make the image look like it was shot on film. It contains a variety of presets based on the physical and photochemical properties of real films, but again you can nerd out and adjust everything from the hardness of the grains to the chromatic sensitivity of your imagined film stock. To take some of the fun out of it, this panel is essentially add grain, color luminance, and curves. Finishing adjustments doesn't have the practical analogs of film types. It's out and out styling of the final image based on darkroom techniques. Here you can tone, split tone, vignette, add borders, etc. I rarely use it for its intended purposes, but sometimes burn edges is a viable alternative to a control point for controlling the edges of the frame. Everything about Silver Efex is designed for speed and ease of use, whilst maintaining maximum control and authenticity. Over on the left, if you use a particular combination of slider settings frequently, you can save it as a custom preset. You can import and export these presets too for sharing or transferring to other machines. There's a history panel at the bottom, allowing you to back out of dead ends and start from where you've previously been. Over on the right, the combination loop and histogram panel provides the option of either a constant zoomed view, good for assessing sharpness, noise, and aim of control points, or a histogram, handy for keeping tabs on dynamic range. Overlaid on these is a zone system numbered 0 to 10, which shows exactly where each of the tonal zones lays on the image, with varying crosshatch patterns. The numbers can be clicked on to keep the crosshatch visible on the image, and more than one can be selected at once. This is useful when you want, say, a particular skin tone to fall exactly in the 80% zone, with highlights in the 90s. This type of technical processing can be easily achieved without constant measuring, using the real-time overlays that Silver Efex provides. 100% zoom is just a tap of the spacebar away, with a navigator appearing automatically at the top right. At the top left are display options for comparison with your original color image, either black and white version alone, a split 2-in-1 version with a movable slider, or a side-by-side comparison. It's all set up to be able to work in the way that you want it to. Let's take a look at some comparisons to show the speed and effectiveness of Silver Efex over Photoshop. What I'm going to do is open 3 images and process each one as appropriate in both Silver Efex and Photoshop. I'm going to time-lapse my workflow, and we'll see how long each method takes, and if the results are different at the end, which is better. Let's start on the first image here. First, I add a black and white adjustment layer and adjust the sliders to get a basic foundation for the final look of the image. Then I add my usual curves layers, one darker, one lighter, and brush over the layer masks to dodge and burn the image, bringing out the lighting texture. This was a very straightforward image to start with, as the lighting was essentially set straight out of camera. A very easy black and white conversion. Finally, I add a high-pass filter set to hard light blending, reduce the opacity according to how sharp I want the strongest areas of texture, and then mask out everywhere else. In the end, this came to around 9 minutes and 46 seconds. Okay, Silver Efex's turn. The neutral conversion looks very good off the bat. First, I hit full dynamic smooth, since to me is generally the best looking for black and white conversion. I drop the midtones so that the background and other areas of fall off are solidly in the shadow region, and adjust the level of soft contrast to get the right level of creamy tonal graduation on the shirt. I darken the whole thing with dynamic brightness, which affects different tonal areas in varying amounts in order to maintain proper contrast, then bring up the shadow tonality protection a little, to stop the shadows from becoming too blocky, and the highlight tonality protection to reduce distracting contrast in the shirt. I darken the hand so that it isn't overpowering the face, and then increase contrast in the modeling light over the face, and I'm pretty much done. After checking the contrast levels against the first one, I found that I may have flattened it out just a little too much, so I add a partial S-curve as an adjustment layer to bring up the highlight regions I've missed. This didn't fully affect what I was looking at, so I added a little dodge here and there to some of the shirt highlights. The final time for silver effects was just 3 minutes and 27 seconds. There are clear differences between the two versions, but neither is particularly better or worse on the whole. Dodge and burn is obviously the better technique for skin, but silver effects did much better on the fabric. This was an easy conversion though. Let's move on to a harder one. Let's try Viking Rub next. Similar lighting setup to the last one, but different skin tones and textures, and generally a little flatter to begin with. Here I'm using a black and white adjustment layer again, but instead of using it for conversion, I'm applying it in luminosity blending in order to separate out my tonal and color information. This provides the base for the rest of the processing. Again, I apply the curves adjustment layers for dodging and burning. I actually do this to almost every image I process, whether I'm using silver effects or not. As usual, the brush cursor is appearing to you slightly below right of where the brush actually is. That's a quirk of the screen capture software. Next, I add a curves layer to finalize the contrast and tonal transitions. Then I desaturate a little, before returning to curves to cool down the shadows slightly. Total time was 9 minutes 58 seconds. Let's give silver effects a try. This time I try a few presets out before settling on full dynamic smooth, just to make sure it's the most appropriate. Immediately I crank up the structure to get the grit I'm looking for in place, before again darkening the midtones and then playing with the various brightness sliders to try to dial in the contrast levels I'm looking for. Then it's straight down to the hands to darken them down and structure them up. Bright hands is an occupational hazard of using a gridded beauty dish in poses like this, but they should never usually be competing with a face in terms of luminance values or contrast. I knock the contrast up just a little to slightly overcome the smoothing of soft contrast, and then I'm done in silver effects. Again, I set the black and white layer to luminosity blending so that I'm controlling the tones with that layer. A little dodge on the eyes since they got darkened slightly too much. And then I adjust the contrast of the image with the opacity slider on the luminance layer. A final desaturation, and I'm done. The two images are very similar in terms of tonal values this time. The contrast levels are about the same. The Photoshop image has a slightly more airbrushed feel, where the silver effects version uses its soft contrast more subtly to create a natural look. Either of these would easily composite, but the silver effects version would probably suit a movie poster more than the Photoshop version. Now for a completely different style, to see how silver effects in Photoshop deal with a new lighting setup and some higher frequency detail. I'm going to crop the image square before I begin, so that both programs are starting on an equal footing. I'm not going to bother removing the lights and cables, since that would be identical for both. Okay, here we go. First I create a black and white adjustment layer, and play with the sliders until everything looks right in proportion to each other. Then, once again, my double curves layers for dodge and burn. I don't really have a set amount to adjust these curves, just what looks right to me. I pretty much undo what I just did with the sliders here, but I wanted to get the background's internal contrast right, and moving the sliders too far one way or the other causes the tonal graduations to break down and the image gets posterized, noisy, or bands. I brighten up the skin since it's a bit muddy due to the soft backlighting, and brighten the highlights in the hair. Then I move on to the dress and add soft contrast, accentuating its form by emphasizing the overall fall of light and shadow. The sharpness across the frame feels wrong to me somehow, so I duplicate the whole image thus far, add a large 500 pixel feather circle selection, invert it, and use that to soften up the corners, but not too much. I use the same selection to add some mild vignetting to play off the flow of light through the scene. I finish up here by adding some dodge and burn to the dress and background respectively, to improve separation. Total time was 11 minutes 15 seconds. Now let's give Silver Efex the same starting point and see how it fares. I run through all of the presets to see if there's one particularly close to my vision for this image, but I don't really want to get into all the fake vintage stuff at this point. On my 500px you can see a final version of this image where I did go that route, but I used the specialized Nik Analog Effects plugin after running it through Silver Efex first. First I use a control point to bring the sky back, because I'm all about dynamic range, doubly so since this is supposed to look somewhat medium formatish. I darken the image with various sliders because I'm really trying to accentuate that soft flow of light coming in from behind, and then I try to bring up the skin a little. Nik has other software to deal with skin, so the effects plugins don't really deal with it too well. Onto the color filters, which I can use to simultaneously darken the sky and foliage whilst brightening the dress. The skin doesn't appear to be touched by the orange filter, which makes sense. I burn the edges to pull that light flow inwards some more, and I'm done. After looking at the Photoshop version, the skin is clearly a little too dark on the Silver Efex image, so I dodged the skin up slightly to finish off. Total time, 4 minutes 8 seconds. I did waste a lot of time looking through presets. Now, comparing the two, it seems to me that Silver Efex has really excelled with this naturalistic, high dynamic range type of image. Photoshop has done an acceptable job, but it looks very much digital rather than filmic. Okay, so test over. What's the takeaway here? Mine is that Silver Efex particularly excels at converting images that would naturally have been shot on black and white film in the first place, whereas on the more modern lighting styles it was a little closer run between it and Photoshop, depending on the nature of the final result you're wanting. That said, nothing stopping you from using Photoshop's dodge and burn facilities after running the image through Silver Efex, so you can have the best of both worlds. As you can probably tell, I have a bit of a love affair going on with Silver Efex. I've always loved the look of proper black and white, and until I discovered this software a couple of years or so ago, I was never able to come close to it. If you do a lot of black and white, or would if you could get it to look right, or are planning to, $150 for near perfection is a steal. If you're on the fence about putting down that much money, or how much use you'll get, there's a 15-day trial to give you time to sit down with some photos and reprocess them properly. Have fun, experiment, hit up the true black and white paper option on MPix, whatever. I hope this little summary has been helpful, especially if you haven't heard of Silver Efex before. If you've made it this far, thanks for watching. If you want to share your own examples from Silver Efex or have any questions or comments, as always, hit up the comments below.